of adaptation. And another adaptation that was made besides what we've had to do here this morning is that I got emails a couple of times this week that snakes had gotten into the church building. It's actually not the first time, I want you to know. Come to think about it, usually it happens about this time of year. Cold weather is arriving, and the warmth of the building seeps out under the weather stripping that is wearing and has not yet regained its priority on the trustee to-do list until something like this happens. And then it does become that priority. Let's get that weather stripping fixed right away. There are snakes in the building. I remember actually a few years ago getting a call from a previous custodian who had quite a great amount of panic in her voice. It sounded from what she was saying that Leviathan had come into the building and had put her in a corner with its scary head reaching up from the great deeps of the earth to keep her cornered in. And when I got the panic call and came right over, I found the poor critter. It wasn't much bigger than a worm, to be honest with you, and was easily disposed outdoors where I hoped it could find a hole in which to hibernate for the season. All right, but you know, snakes, when they come in the door, and actually they came, these two, I believe, or at least one of them, came in the door behind the kitchen where the bathrooms are, okay? Now, am I giving you an image that is one that's going to bring a little panic to you? I can imagine that perhaps I am. Because when we talk about like things like Leviathan, which the ancients conjured up as a way to put an exclamation point on how the waters, the chaotic waters, could be scary. The snake kind of was the point where he said, yes, it was that affirmation. But in fact, it doesn't really need a Leviathan for us to consider how waters can be troubled. Does that give you a little bit of a glimpse into what's going on in the text from Matthew today? When the disciples had been with Jesus on the other side, on the foreign side actually, the part distant from Israel, and Jesus had been preaching there and doing miracles. I think the miracle that he did was he broke the bread and fed like 7,000 people. After all of that, Jesus had told the disciples to go ahead across the sea, and it was going to be night when they traveled across the Sea of Galilee. And as they went, after his command for them to go, even though he went up and was kind of leaving them behind, about the fourth watch, let's say 4 a.m. in the morning, the 12 cry out in their fearfulness on the sea, "It's a ghost!" Because that's who they see. They see somebody coming across the water. They can't imagine a figure coming to them across the water. It's equivalent to finding a snake taking a drink in the Greek. That's what he said. Which is, I think, is something really important to say. Ego eimi is how Jesus responds to them when they see him walking across the water. In English, it's kind of translated, "It's me." But that really doesn't convey what that phrase means. If you want to be grammatical about it, it means, "It is I." But if you want to get theological about it, what he's saying is, "I am." Does that register a little bit more with you? Some of you who know the scriptures well, when he says, "I am," ego eimi. The Gospel of Mark tells the same story, in such a way that when Jesus does speak, it increases rather than decreases the disciples' sense of alarm. If they were afraid of the storm, they were even more afraid when Jesus got in the boat, because how is it that they could be in the boat with one who is so amazing and so beyond their imagination that he speaks a word and it stills the storm? That's how Mark wants to put it. But Matthew has a different slant to it. The emphasis on a different syllable, if you would. Matthew doesn't want Jesus to be seen as the one who is invoking wonder. Instead, he wants us to understand that when Jesus is speaking, he is the great I am. That same one that some of you might have noticed when you watched the Sunday school lesson today, when Moses saw the burning bush and turned aside, and when he got there, a voice came from the burning bush that said, put off your shoes, you're on holy ground. And Moses in his temerity asked the voice, who are you? Because the voice said, I want you to go and free my people in Egypt to come to me in the promised land. And he said, well, who should I say sent me to you? And the voice said, tell them, I am who I am, has sent you. And that's how the Jews began to know the name of God, Yahweh, which is the Hebrew way of saying, Ego Eimi. I am who I am. So what Matthew is trying to get at is that the one speaking to the disciples is the one who commands. It is the voice of God that is speaking to them on the waters. Now, not in any kind of terrorizing way or threatening way. I want you to understand that. Although to meet with God is something that gets brought out in us. But this is also the same God who, in freeing the people of Israel, told them what their way, how they could follow him and be responsive to him is by loving God with their whole heart, mind, soul, and strength, and loving their neighbor as themselves. In other words, this is the God, like in Micah, when God says, people say, what do we have to do? And God says, do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with your God. This is the same God they meet. Not a terror, not a threat, but nevertheless a leader who leads them to be obedient to this command for their wholeness, for the way that they can live as ways of being responsive to God's leadership. This last week I was on a phone call, a seminar, I guess, of some sort, with a bunch of other pastors. And the seminar was on how to navigate in our stormy and political moment right now in the nation with justice, love, and humility, which really is that kind of Micah phrase said in a little bit different way. And the convener invited us to be like the disciples who were rowing across the Sea of Galilee. Well, the speaker didn't put it in those terms, but I took it in those terms. That we were to be those who were navigating through troubled waters, and yet the speaker said, I know as pastors you also want to remain faithful to seek to stay on the side of justice. You want to stay faithful, to stay on the side of what the Lord commands. Now, Peter, and Bradley, and the song that we sang, Peter is in this story the one who gets all the newspaper headlines. And it is something remarkable to think about how Peter is so brave to actually step out of the water, even though he gets rebuked for not having enough faith to just continue to walk and looks at the wind and the waves and begins to sink. But, think about that. This is the new twist I want to put on the story for us today. Did anybody else ever after that walk on the water that you know of? I mean, I'm not talking about, wintertime when there's ice. Did anybody else? I mean, is that a practice of disciples to walk on water? No. And maybe, and this is according to a commentary by a man named Richard Swanson, maybe where the real faith is not in Peter getting out of the boat. But maybe it's the disciples rowing across the lake to the other side. Maybe Peter's just kind of showing off. But the disciples are actually doing what Jesus has commanded. Because Jesus had been on the other side and had broken the bread, and 7,000 were fed, and had gone up to pray, and they left them all behind according to his command. Go on over to the other side. In the church, in the history of the church, a boat, as it is in our St. Andrew logo, the boat is a symbol of the church. So maybe in this story there is a symbolism to say, be the church. And you know what it's like to be the church? It means that you're going to have to row in some rough waters against the wind. You're going to have to keep going when it's difficult. And that's what we're commanded to do. Indeed, that is something that we're commanded to do. We are called to be those who respond to Jesus' commands. And he does command in this story. He commands the disciples to go across. He commands Peter to come out and walk on the water. He commands the storm to go away. Even when the disciples mistake him for a supernatural being, he says something to them that says, this isn't just a supernatural person. This is our Lord who is telling us what to do. Be not afraid. He commands him in that way. When Swanson talks about this in his commentary, he brings up kind of an interesting person to illustrate this. Do some of you remember Vice Admiral James Stockman by any chance?
Ross Perot's vice president.
Right on.
Right vice president, okay.
So, back 28 years ago, when it wasn't just George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton, but also Ross Perot who were running for the presidency, there was Dan Quayle, Al Gore, and Vice Admiral James Stockman, who were on the stage for the vice presidential debate. And it didn't go very well for Vice Admiral Stockman. Because when he got up there, he started his introduction by asking two questions. Who am I, and why am I here? And he meant to answer these questions as the debate went on, but he kind of lost his place. And he looked old. And when he got asked a question later on in the debate, he said, would you repeat it? I didn't have my hearing aid turned up. And that became, later that week, the Saturday Night Live skit. And poor Vice Admiral Stockman was humiliated in that Saturday Night Live skit, which was really too bad. Because as somebody else said about him later, really his only fault was that he was bad on television. He never got back to those questions, who am I and why am I here, which were really important questions because Perot was the surprise candidate and he kind of just recruited Admiral Stockman a bit at the last moment. And so it was like he's the surprise guy on the stage, and so he had to answer those questions. And who he was, in fact, was a person who served and was like the highest person ever captured in the Vietnam War, and he was captured near the beginning of the war, and for 7.5 years he was a prisoner of war in Vietnam. He was first in and last out, pretty much, basically, in that war. And he learned in that time there to be somebody who could be sustained by his faith. And his faith was this. Actually, he became a philosopher and taught philosophy at the Citadel and at Stanford after his captivity. And the kind of philosophy he taught was Stoicism, which is an ancient Greek philosophy about how to kind of keep your way even when everything else going on around you wants to dissuade you from doing that. He gained this wisdom because of being in this prisoner of war camp and seeing what happened to optimists when they were there with him. And see if these words don't apply to us today. Oh, they were the ones, he wrote, who said, we're going to be out by Christmas. And Christmas would come. And Christmas would go. And then they'd say, we're going to be out by Easter. And Easter would come and Easter would go. And then Thanksgiving. And then it would be Christmas again. And they died of a broken heart. This is a very important lesson. For you must never confuse faith that you will prevail in the end, and you cannot afford to lose that kind of faith, but you should never confuse it with discipline to confront the most brutal facts of your current reality, whatever they might be. You can never confuse faith that you will prevail in the end, which you can never afford to lose, nevertheless with the discipline to confront the most brutal facts of your current reality, whatever they may be. Does that sound like good advice for us living in 2020 and applying it to distance learning, as Brad started our service with? Of course, Jesus wasn't a stoic, but I don't think that the Admiral's lesson would have been lost on him. Actually, I think instead, what Jesus would say is, it's not the brutal facts that are the thing that we have to endure and persevere through. It's with the faith that Jesus taught. It's the faith that the Lord commanded the disciples to have. That's the thing that persists, and we need to persist in. And in Matthew, Jesus is that one who is the Lord. He's like the king. He's like the one who tells you how it's to go. He's like the new Moses who's going to tell us how we should live. It starts out with not shepherds coming to worship at the manger, but the Magi coming, the foreigners. It's not a tribal kind of religion. I think Brad said that well in his call to worship. You know, our Christianity is not a tribal faith. It isn't like we're the only group that really counts and everybody else has to be excluded from the way we see things. But nevertheless, our faith does have a center, and our faith does call us to listen to the words of Jesus. And it doesn't, there's once this thing called the prayer of Jabez, which is expand your territory, which isn't what Jesus said. He wasn't trying to get us to expand our tribal territory. He was actually trying to get us to share and let others into our territory, to be a part of that people of God, so that the whole earth, instead of just Israel, would be God's people. And he also said things like, be the salt of the earth and be the light of the world. Let your light shine. Put it up on a bushel, so that on a stand, so that everybody can see, not only see the light, but see by the light. He also said, if someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to them the left cheek also. So that by you having this kind of higher righteousness, by you living with justice and love and humility, that these are the things by which you share this good news. I think those are important things for us to hear today as this election draws near. And as we look not only to the election in 2 weeks and 2 days, but also we look past the election, because it will come and it will go. And how is it that Jesus can command us, like he did the disciples, to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with our God? I've been puzzling a little bit on those words this week. Doing justice is a sense of making sure everybody gets to live with the same conditions, and that there's no favoritism of anybody over the rest. There's nobody who expands their territory and takes away from somebody else. But indeed, there is a sense of sharing in that land that God gives. There's a way to do that by loving one another, which which in some ways isn't necessarily having all affection for every person that we meet, but it is to say that they are considered to be beloved by God. And so therefore, with respect and with a sense of charity, we are to regard everybody else in that way as well. And to walk humbly, I was kind of thinking about that. Is to walk humbly and have a sense of equity towards everybody. Is to say, we all share in this life together. We all share in the calling of God to be human beings with its dignity and its nobility. Is that what it is to maybe know what it is to walk humbly with our God? Is it also to not think of ourselves too highly, but to consider others better than ourselves, or at least equal to ourselves? I think these are the things that we need to consider as we approach this election and as we look at going beyond it. As a pastor, I know that was why we were on this seminar together. We are in the midst of pastors leading in a stormy sea right now. It's like hard. What do you say? Can you speak to these kinds of things? Can you talk about them in church where, church is supposed to be separated from all those kinds of things? Well, at least that's what our secular age has told us. But instead of reducing our faith just to my personal relationship with God, doesn't what Jesus command tell us to do something that's broader than that gets out into the public square? It's where, as pastors, when we try to navigate the troubled waters, we know that we are rowing into a headwind, and we are called to persist. Someone in the call said something that really struck me about how the place where we have our real hopes and the things that we want to see happen are also the place where the fear is the strongest as well. Almost so that the two things, hope and fear, occupy the same space. I imagine that's not just something true for pastors, but for all of us. How is it that we want the very best for our country in the election and for our country with regard to one another, and yet having that hope, we have to also name the division and the difficulty that is there. And nevertheless, we have to hold that hope and that fear together and still respond to Jesus.